Me has preguntado qué es lo que haría y qué es lo que no haría. Te voy a decir lo que haré y lo que no haré. No serviré por más tiempo a aquello en lo que no creo, llámese mi hogar, mi patria o mi religión, y trataré de expresarme de algún modo, en vida y arte, tan libremente como me sea posible, tan plenamente como me sea posible, cuando para mi defensa las solas armas que me permito usar, silencio, destierro y astucia. Me has hecho confesar los miedos que siento, pero te voy a decir ahora cuáles son las cosas que no me dan miedo. No me da miedo estar solo, ni de ser propuesto a otro, ni de abandonar lo que tenga que abandonar, sea lo que sea. No me da miedo el cometer un error, aunque sea un error de importancia, un error de por vida, tan largo tal vez como la misma eternidad. I will tell you what I will do and what I will not do. I will not serve that in which I no longer believe, whether it calls itself my home, my fatherland, or my church. And I will try to express myself in some mode of life or art as freely as I can, and as wholly as I can, using for my defense the only arms I allow myself to use: silence, exile, and cunning. You made me confess the fears that I have, but I will tell you also what I do not fear. I do not fear to be alone or to be spurned for another or to leave whatever I have to leave. And I am not afraid to take a mistake, even a great mistake, a lifelong mistake, and perhaps as long as eternity too.
Muchas gracias, Juan. Bueno, pues vamos a seguir con el congreso. Para mí es un gran placer y un orgullo poder presentar a José Luis Venegas en esta conferencia plenaria. José Luis fue alumno nuestro allá por el año finales de los 90. Yo recuerdo, ayer le comentaba que José Luis es de Palma del Río y él se venía en el tren con las gafas de sol puestas, disimulando por si cuando pasaba el revisor para que no le cobrara. Pero yo creo que pasó y venía muy despierto. Él estudió aquí, no sé si tú lo sabes, tú coincidiste con Manuel Rodríguez, también conocido como Tote King. Coincidiste ahí en la clase de crítica literaria con Jacobo Canadi y otra gente así. Cada uno sigue un camino diferente. Como sabemos, Tote King tiene sus más y sus menos con nosotros. José Luis, en cambio, recibió una beca para estudiar en Chapel Hill. Hizo su doctorado en literatura comparada en Chapel Hill. Más adelante consiguió un contrato y es actualmente profesor a tiempo completo, titular de la prestigiosa Universidad de Wake Forest, y es el autor de estos 3 libros que tenéis aquí, entre otras cosas. Hoy nos va a hablar de un cuarto libro que va a presentar dentro de poco tiempo. Él escribió hace unos años Decolonizing Joyce, que creo recordar que era una elaboración de tu tesis doctoral. Después publicó todas en editoriales de mucho prestigio. Después publicó sobre unas cartas, ¿no? Transatlantic Epistolary Letters, y últimamente ha escrito que estoy muy interesado en leer The Sublime South. Parece que había un campo ahí que alguien tenía que hablar de Sublime South. No quiero entretenerle más porque nos va a hablar de su próximo libro y nos va a hablar a continuación sobre Joyce. Así que cuando quiera, José Luis. Muchas gracias.
Gracias, Ricardo, y muchas gracias por invitarme. Esto es una ocasión muy especial para mí, ¿no? Un homecoming en más de... ¿Se oye? ¿Sí? ¿Se oye ahora? Es un homecoming para mí en más de un sentido, ¿no? Primero porque vuelvo a mi alma mater, a la universidad, con tantas caras conocidas aquí, y también a los encuentros, ¿no? Porque yo empecé mi desarrollo como crítico literario, crítico cultural, en estos encuentros de Joyce. El primero fue en Ávila, que fue allá por el 2000, creo, y después en Huelva, y bueno, y todo surgió a partir de ahí, ¿no? Y bueno, un pequeño preámbulo antes de la charla para hablar de la intrahistoria, ¿no? Decía que la biografía de Joyce estaba entre Unamuno y Lincoln. Bueno, pues el término de Unamuno de intrahistoria, sobre cómo yo me metí en lo de Joyce, ¿no? Que ha ido y ha venido, pero siempre ha estado presente. Fue creo que fue en segundo de carrera con el profesor José Carnero. Leí el retrato del artista, ¿no? En edición de Álvarez Amorós, y ahí vi pues las notas a pie de página del estudio preliminar donde aparecían pues mis profesores, ¿no? Y entonces ya me di cuenta de que no estaba solo en mi admiración a ese libro, ¿no? Porque lo otro un poco entraba así a tuerca, pero el retrato del artista me fascinó, ¿no? Y rápidamente fui a la librería Giraldillo a comprarme el Ulises, ¿no? Y ahí I hit the wall, y el libro hit the wall también muchas veces, ¿no? Y mi ejemplar, que todavía lo tengo, el de Penguin, con introducción de Declan Kyber, ¿no? Que a la postre fue profesor mío en Duke, pues está bastante rotillo, ¿no? Por las puntas. y bueno, pues a partir de ahí me lo tomé como un desafío, como algo que quería pues manejar, entender, y fue a través de Joyce como yo entré en la literatura comparada, a través de Ricardo, gracias a su ejemplo, y a la literatura latinoamericana, ¿no? Porque yo entré a Borges, a Cortázar, a lo que se llama la nueva narrativa, a través de Joyce, ¿no? Y dijo Borges, precisamente, que Joyce es más una literatura que un literato, ¿no? Y con eso quiero empezar, lo voy a decir en inglés, porque como dijo Ricardo, no es un libro, es algo más modesto, es un capítulo de un libro, de una colección que va a salir con Cambridge University Press, The New Joyce Studies, ¿no? Entonces me pidieron que justamente poco antes de que me invitara Ricardo, que colaborara con un capítulo sobre Joyce and Latin American Literature, ¿no? Entonces no me ha dado tiempo a traducirlo, me hubiera gustado darlo en español, pero bueno, va a ser en inglés, así que... Pero sí, la primera cita es en español y es de Borges. Joyce no es un literato, o es menos un literato que una literatura. Now think of a qualifier for this literature, and you'll probably say that it is difficult, innovative, experimental, shocking, even elitist. For early critics of Joyce, all these adjectives were synonymous with modernist. So starting in the 1920s, modernism quickly became shorthand for a new literary style that valued form over content, aesthetic novelty over subject matter, and artistic autonomy over ideological commitment. T.S. Eliot, Ezra Pound, and the generation of critics that they influenced defined modernism in opposition to non-literary matters and national affiliations. Ulysses was therefore valued for its linguistic precision and parallels with, I noticed that this comes and goes, so just bear with me, Homer's Odyssey, not its Irish context. Eliot claimed that the novel's form had the importance of a scientific discovery and could restore and renew shattered Europe after World War I. Invoking arguments that would later appall Marxists, Eliot said, or he thought that order might be forever lost in society and history, but not in high art like Ulysses. Pound also believed that, and I quote, the sense of style that Joyce's narrative represents would have saved America or Europe, but only because, he added, he fled Ireland and detached himself from, his words, local stupidity. So modernist Joyce and Irish Joyce thus became as antithetical as form and content in Ulysses. Critics from Seamus Dean and Declan Kyber to Edna Duffy and Luke Gibbons have blurred this opposition in recent years, seeing in Joyce's modernist achievement a genuinely Irish experience, against both Eliot's and Pound's ahistorical approach and Marxist condemnations of modernism as a withdrawal from politics and history. These critics connect Joyce's formal experiments and Ireland's colonial context. As Gibbons has recently put it, Joyce's, quote, Joyce's Irishness on this reading is intrinsic to modernism, thus countering a tendency in the first generations of Joyce criticism to attribute his formal breakthroughs to exile on the European mainland and to his association with the metropolitan vanguard of Pound, Eliot, and others. But long before Gibbons' 2015 assertion, and this is my point here today, Latin American writers integrated rather than separated Joyce's stylistic experimentation and Irish marginality, or his sense of style and local stupidity, as Pound dismissively put it. For Latin Americans, Joyce was not a European master to be revered and imitated, but a marginal writer reaching a periphery from another periphery. The literature that Borges recognized in Joyce was as difficult, innovative, and experimental as it was for the modernists, but it was also less metropolitan, canonical, and monumental, and more eccentric, irreverent, and labyrinthine. In a 1951 lecture, The Argentine Writer and Tradition, El escritor argentino y la tradición, Borges stated that for Argentine writers, creativity and innovation should mean displacing, not restoring, the Western literary tradition. To illustrate his point, he drew analogies that also explain his understanding of Joyce. The Argentines, like the Jews in Europe, and the Irish are both outsiders of Western culture and prominent discoverers of new forms and ideas. So think of Einstein, Freud, Marx, Yeats, Shaw, and of course, Joyce. Borges translates marginality into invention and discovery, and suggests that being universal and cosmopolitan is just another way of being local and national. Borges' opinions about literary innovation were supported and developed by Latin American novelists writing in his wake. Just as for Pound and Eliot, Ulysses became an important reference for the new narrative that originated with Borges' short fiction in the 1940s and culminated with Julio Cortázar, José Lezama Lima, Guillermo Cabrera Infante, and Fernando del Paso in the 1960s and 1970s, what is commonly known as the boom of Latin American literature. So among these writers, attention to the modernist form of Joyce, of Ulysses, to myth as a structural device, to linguistic playfulness, to narrative fragmentation, inspire ways to express distance from Western literary models, not strategies to put the fragments of broken Europe back together, as Eliot and others did. Therefore, the development of what critic Gerald Martin has called the Latin American Ulyssian novel cannot be simply explained by the global spread of modernism. Among other scholars, Martin interprets Joyce's impact on Latin America as a process of assimilation, where European form is assimilated by the periphery. And then the upshot of this, what has happened after this, critics following Martin, is that the term Latin American modernism has gained wide currency, right? So what I'm trying to do here, following Borges, is something different, to sort of dispense with the category of modernism, to look at this interaction between Joyce and Latin American writers. So seeing modernism as an umbrella encompassing Joyce and the Latin American boom risks flattening out the type of irreverence, of eccentricity, that Borges embraced in his 1951 lecture. So when he compared the Argentines with the Irish, he saw splintering off, not convergence on, a common tradition or aesthetic paradigm. So instead of prefiguring Latin American modernism, Borges opens what we might call, following François Lyonnais and Xu Meishi, a minor transnational literary space. Minor transnationalism is not centripetal, pulling the outside in, but transversal, looking at the interaction among non-metropolitan cultures. The term captures Borges' irreverence of the periphery, while encouraging comparison that resists assimilation. It also connects with Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari's notion of minor literature, a literature written by a subordinated or marginalized people as revolt against a dominant or major group. In contexts where minor literature is written in a major language, expression, and this is Deleuze and Guattari, must break forms, encourage ruptures, and new sproutings. So a minor reading of Joyce in Latin America must therefore compare without conflating, appreciate the difference where there's resemblance, and see technical innovation not, or perhaps not only, as modernist form. To do so, one must dispense, as I said before, with conceptual straitjackets, such as modernism. and restore the complexity and freshness of Joyce's first literary audiences in Latin America. What terms did Latin American writers use to describe Joyce? And how did they engage with these terms in their own writing, in their own creative work? Borges, who wrongly proclaimed himself the first Hispanic adventurer to reach Joyce's Ulysses, and wrong because Antonio Marichalar, the Spaniard, beat him to the punch by about 2 months, published a review in Revista de Occidente. So again, Borges provides a suitable point of entry to explore this complexity, this freshness of Joyce's first literary audiences in Latin America. In 1925, he published a short review of the novel and a partial translation of his last page in the Argentine journal Proa. Here, Ulysses is described as, Borges, total reality. A total reality. This is going to be an important term, important concept here today. So a total reality where mind and matter, thought and feeling, abstraction and sensation coexist in unresolved tension. The duality of existence, Borges wrote, is embedded in this book. And then he goes on to explain what he means by that. That ontological unrest that is amazed not only at being, but at being in this precise world where one can find doorways and words and playing cards and electrical writing in the crisp clarity of the night. So in stark contrast to Eliot's assessment, Borges does not isolate the technical virtuosity of Ulysses from its engagement with the here and now. Instead of controlling and giving shape to experience, as Eliot stated, Joyce, on Borges's reading, lets experience shape narrative form. Borges's own chaotic enumeration, doorways and words and playing cards and electrical writing, evokes the multiple styles and stream of consciousness technique in Ulysses. But it is also a recurring aspect of Borges's own narrative, a device that recurs in short stories from El Aleph to Funes el Memorioso, incidentally a story that he included in his 1941 obituary of Joyce. So in these short stories, we see an open-ended, fluid, and total reality, right? And with this, with the 1925 Proa review by Borges, we see the beginning of a trend that was continued by other boom and post-boom writers in Latin America. And it's basically, to put it in a nutshell, that by talking about Joyce, they were talking about themselves, right? So Borges' engagement with Joyce spanned decades and shifted back from admiration to condemnation to indifference. His assessment of Ulysses, however, remained quite consistent. He never saw it as a rewriting of the Odyssey destined to become a modern classic, but as a book that was both labyrinth and monument, chaos and order. In Fragment on Joyce, Fragmento sobre Joyce, written upon Joyce's death in 1941, this is obituary, the obituary I was talking about a minute ago, he undermines Eliot's mythical method and also Stuart Gilbert's emphasis on Homeric parallels in his classic study, James Joyce's Ulysses, published in 1930. For the Argentine writer, the strict construction and classical discipline of the work are simply insignificant, Borges' word. He later confessed in an interview that the novel left him with a sensation of chaos. But a chaos, he said, that is really a cosmos, a secret cosmos. Narrative Art and Magic, El Arte Narrativo y la Magia, a short essay published in 1932, strikes another blow against modernist Joyce while illuminating what Borges meant by secret cosmos. Here, Borges, following Eliot, sees Ulysses as the first example of a new genre that will supplant the defunct realist novel. Unlike Eliot, however, Borges focuses on what he calls the omens and corroborations that resonate in the text. He does not provide any examples, but take for example, Stephen's recollection in Proteus of his dream of a street of harlots, where there's a red carpet and a man holding a melon against his face, right? So these are one of those prophetic omens that Borges was writing about. An omen of his encounter, Stephen's encounter with Bloom later in the day. Together, Stephen and Bloom will wander around Dublin's Red District, a street of harlots. And afterward, Bloom, who worshipped his wife's melon-shaped buttocks, as Margaret said before, we all know how he kissed the plum mellow, yellow's mellow, melons of a rump on each plum melonous hemisphere. So Bloom will offer the youth, the young artist, the red carpet treatment, right? Inviting him to wrap up the night with a cup of cocoa at his house. Ulysses abounds in these sort of trivial details that weave interlocking correspondences unrelated to the Homeric framework. The omens and corroborations, the secret cosmos that Borges perceives in Ulysses shifts emphasis from the abstract formalism of modernism to the ever-changing shape of this precise world, to quote his 1925 review. As critical terms, they reverse modernist readings that, following Stephen Dedalus in a portrait, value the static elements of Ulysses and denigrated or ignore its kinetic components. In chapter 5, Stephen explains that unlike kinetic art, static art is about the here and now and focuses on such abstract qualities as wholeness, harmony, and radiance. Loud echoes of this approach are found in, among others, Eliot, Pound, and Virginia Woolf, who in her essay Modern Fiction from 1921 described the type of experience that should make it to the pages of a book as a luminous halo, a semi-transparent envelope surrounding us from the beginning of consciousness to the end, with as little mixture of the alien and external as possible. In contrast, Borges' conflation of the static and the kinetic aspects captures the formal complexity of Ulysses, as well as Joyce's ironical approach to Stephen's modernist bias. Stephen's pompous exposition of his aesthetic theory in a portrait is interrupted by the harsh roar of a truck and deflated by his friend Cranley, who dismissively remarks that such lofty thoughts are out of place in a place like Ireland, this miserable, God-forsaken island, as he put it. The episode juxtaposes what early critics saw as opposites: Stephen's self-sufficient mind and external reality, particularly Irish reality. This interplay continues in Ulysses through the contrast between Stephen and Leopold Bloom. In Ithaca, Bloom is described as a kinetic poet with a kinetic temperament, a water lover who enjoys the hydrokinetic turgidity of water and its changes of state. Where Stephen, and his scholastic distrust of the aquacities of thought and language, make him a hydrophobe. If Stephen sees his life as a theorem, Bloom compares it to his bowel movements. Life might be so, he concludes after he defecates in Calypso. Stephen elevates art over life. Bloom rips a page off a literary magazine to wipe himself. While Stephen engages in philosophical conversation in Dublin's National Library, Bloom wonders whether classical statues have anuses. The stone goddesses of the museum that he intends to visit inspire not ideas of aesthetic, balance, and order, but ruminations on bodily functions and how they might relate to art. Quote, lovely forms of women sculpted Junonian, immortal, lovely. And we stuffing food in one hole and out behind. Food, child, blood, dung, earth, food. Have to feed it. They have never looked. I'll look today. Keep her one see. Bend down, let something drop. See if she... Of course, in a book in which extremes meet and Jew-Greek is Greek-Jew, the differences between Bloom and Stephen reveal the deeper affinities of this episode, where kinesis and stasis, life and art, come together in a way that remains as recursive yet inconclusive as Bloom's rendering of the digestive cycle. Bloom's enumeration recalls Borges' description of Ulysses and reveals a sort of repetitiveness and order chaos that undercuts the Homeric framework and highlights the book's engagement with lived reality. This aspect manifests as both form and content, as realistic representation and structural principle. Some early readers recoiled from Joyce's attention to all aspects of everyday life, which they often attributed to his Irish origin. In a 1917 review of a portrait, H.G. Wells observed that Joyce writes about dung and gastric juices and other aspects that, quote, modern drainage, modern decorum have taken out of ordinary intercourse and conversation, not out of malicious intent, but because he lacks what he called a normal sensory basis, which he relates to his Irish nationality. This defective sensory basis is probably what caused Virginia Woolf to condemn Ulysses as the underbred book of an egotistic, insistent, raw, striking, and ultimately nauseating writer. Contemporary critics have inverted this argument to celebrate Joyce's smut as an anti-colonial attack against English propriety. Discussing Wells's review, Andrew Gibson, recently in 2002, claims that, quote, Joyce had introduced the sordid and obscene elements in the novel with malign and seditious intent that were part of his Irish assault on England and English culture. Borges anticipates and enriches this reading by asking us to see kinesis and stasis as two interconnected halves in not just the content, but also the form of Ulysses. So what Borges meant by form was something much more complex and intricate than the whole order of myth so dear to the modernists. It was a response to the shock of lived experience, not to a hallowed tradition where an Irishman might feel as displaced as an Argentine or a Jew. This displacement finds expression in a fictional world shot through with omens and corroborations that playfully and irreverently challenge our reading habits and our normal sensory basis, to use H.G. Wells' phrase. Inviting multiple reading experiences through unpredictable narrative paths, the world is, as Borges put it, a total reality. A reality where nothing is left out, and yet everything becomes interrelated in a way that does not differ much from Bloom's digestive enumeration. Perforating the text, in one whole and out another, the correspondences that Borges noted weave a text where form and structure cannot be separated from the stuff of life in early 20th century Dublin. Borges' terms, omens, corroborations, total reality, straddle criticism and art, since they describe Ulysses as much as Borges' own fiction. His short story, The Immortal, published in 1947, is a good example of a total reality that resonates with puzzling echoes and allusions. The story squeezes the history of Western literature into the biography of Marcus Flaminius Rufus, a Roman soldier under the Emperor Diocletian that set out to find the river of immortality and the city of the immortals. Abandoned by his companions, he manages to reach the legendary city, but instead of finding its inhabitants, he only comes across a tribe of mute cave dwellers on the dusty banks of a nearby stream. Eventually, he discovers that the stream contains the waters of eternal life, that one of the cave dwellers is in fact Homer, and that the others are his fellow immortals. Rufus, who had unknowingly drunk from the river, now joins them. He becomes an immortal, right? And through the centuries, he reflects on what it means to be immortal, an experience without limits, a bewildering total reality, where he is at once everybody and nobody. His narrative becomes both a scale reduction and an overblown amplification of the Odyssey, with echoes from other Western classics, from Pliny, Descartes, Giambattista Vico, Thomas de Quincey, and George Bernard Shaw. But rather than ordering and giving shape to Rufus's manifold experience, these allusions reflect the bafflement, confusion, and even despair of immortal life. Invoking Eliot's reading of Joyce with ironic intent, Borges highlights the literary allusions in Rufus's text, but only to create confusion between originals and copies, models and imitations. Through an intricate system of omens and corroborations, Rufus becomes Ulysses, Homer, the Wandering Jew, and eventually everyone and no one. No one, the last name that he assumes, echoes his first persona as an immortal, Ulysses. Shortly after his arrival at the city, Rufus adopted the cave dweller who turns out to be Homer and called him Argus, Ulysses' dog in the Odyssey. By the end of the narrative, he becomes no one, a reference to the name that Ulysses uses in the Odyssey to deceive the Cyclops. The implication is that in all his versions and permutations, the immortal is still one and the same person, and eternity is cyclical, repetitive, and ultimately meaningless, very much like Bloom's enumeration of the digestive cycle. This dizzying, elusive texture reflects the architecture of the city of the immortals. Its entrance, a dark underground maze with an indefinite number of geometric chambers with doors leading endlessly from chamber to chamber, anticipates the city, a labyrinth where order and symmetry coexist with chaos and futility. This urban layout recalls Borges's reading of Ulysses. It might not be a coincidence that in the poem Invocación a Joyce, that we just heard, published in 1969, Borges describes the Irishman as the creator of arduous labyrinths, infinitesimal and infinite, laberintos arduos, infinitesimales, e infinitos. The similarities become more apparent, similarities between the city of the immortals and Borges's reading of Joyce become more apparent when we realize that the city that Rufus finds is in fact a reconstruction of the original city of the immortals. Instead of recapturing its former harmony, order, and shape, the immortals could only achieve, quote, a parody or inversion of their model. This reconstruction, a chaotic rearrangement of the ruins bequeathed by the past, or tradition, parallels the narrative composition of Ulysses. Like the perplexing architecture of the city, the secret cosmos that Borges finds in Ulysses stresses the creative eccentricity that the irreverent parodies that he associated with the Argentines, the Irish, and the Jews. So now, if Borges' fiction has been widely recognized as the precursor of the Latin American boom, so should his reading of Joyce. Traces of his approach can be perceived in such key figures as Julio Cortázar, José Lezama Lima, and Guillermo Cabrera Infante, who, like Borges, established strong links between their own creative writing and criticism of Joyce. Cortázar's Rayuela, 1963, the centerpiece of the boom, cannot be fully understood without a reference to the author's engagement with Ulysses. So in an interview, he was once asked, could you please name 5 books that you say from a bonfire that will burn all the books in the world? And he could only mention one, Ulysses. And then Joyce's book, Ulysses, remained a constant reference for his own fiction, for Cortázar's fiction. In 1959, 4 years before the publication of Rayuela, he's trying to explain his work in progress to a friend, and he writes a letter to this friend, and he says, if you want to understand what I'm doing, think of some chapters of Ulysses. How can one write a novel when everything should be unwritten and unlearned, when one needs to start from scratch in a pre-Adamic condition? So he was stressing radical novelty, burning the playing field instead of classical structure, reconstructing like Eliot and Pound saw it. So, and then Cortázar is also echoing Borges and anticipating the baffling narrative of Rayuela, a modern-day odyssey where the reader encounters shock and displacement rather than the comforts of homecoming. The book centers on Horacio Oliveira, an Argentine expatriate living in Paris, and his efforts to break away from the deadening grip of convention and habit. Instead of providing a clear itinerary for this metaphysical search, the book offers multiple reading experiences. It can be read linearly from chapter 1 to 155, or hopscotching, like in a Rayuela, hopscotch, from one chapter to another, based on the apparently random directions listed in the table of instructions. Regardless of the pattern one chooses, the novel mocks the closure of plot in a section subtitled Expendable Chapters. This segment contains, among many other things, an eclectic collection of philosophical musings titled Moreliana, after Morelli, Oliveira's philosopher friend. In chapter 79, Morelli, whose authorial role making a standing for Cortázar himself, an alter ego of sorts, Morelli offers what is perhaps the most complete meta-literary reflection on Rayuela. Morelli describes here a new literary genre, which he calls the roman comique in French, the comic novel, whose defining characteristics are exemplified by Ulysses. This genre replaces all novelistic conventions with new ways of characterization, narrative structure, and authorship. Meaning here is never fixed and always depends on the reader's active participation, who must see the text not as a form based on formulas, but as a figura, right? Figura, waiting to be read. By reading it, Morelli explains, I mean generating it. Traditionally, the term figura refers to the allegorical interpretation of biblical events. It involves, according to Eric Auerbach, seeing one event through another. They point to one another and remain provisional and incomplete unless taken together as the anticipation of something in the future, what Auerbach calls the actual, real, and definitive event. So, for example, Abraham in the Bible, Abraham's attempted sacrifice of his son Isaac, and Jonah's 3 days in the belly of the fish before he is released form a figura with the definitive event of Jesus' death and resurrection, right? What Morelli retains from this concept is his provisional and incomplete nature. And to show how repetition could also be newness, he compares figural meanings to the phoenix, the mythological bird that is cyclically born again from the ashes of his predecessor and never attains definitive shape. The relationship among the main characters in Rayuela respond to this pattern. Refined and cosmopolitan Oliveira is set against his untutored and impulsive lover, La Maga, and his provincial hometown friend, Traveler. These differences point to similarities that never reach what Auerbach called an actual, real, and definitive moment of conciliation or resolution. Oliveira's quest to transcend logic and rationality finds answers neither in La Maga's intuition nor Traveler's Argentine parochialism. As Oliveira cryptically puts it, the difference between Traveler and myself is that we're almost identical. Mirroring the novel's structure, Oliveira's search finds no unity, only a tantalizing constellation of partial answers. In Rayuela, the fun is in the journey, not the destination. Morelli's figura corresponds quite closely to the inconclusive web of correspondences that Borges found in Ulysses and that Joyce himself evoked in multiple references to Phoenix and to the portmanteau from spark to finish in Finnegan's Wake, a book that intensified the conflation of repetition and newness that is already present in Ulysses. So Cortázar Morelli's Phoenix-like figura can therefore be added to the Joycean lexicon that Borges opened with omens, corroborations, and order chaos. This lexicon is itself a figura, where understandings of Joyce and literary self-reflection point to one another, and both point to a type of writing that is at once total and inconclusive, chaotic and ordered, local and universal. I'm going to skip over some stuff here due to time constraints. I was going to talk about Cortázar and how he engaged with other Ulyssian novels, such as Adán Buenos Aires by Leopold Marechal, Les Amalino, and they enrich this lexicon, this glossary of terms that sort of teach us how to read Joyce through the eyes of these Latin American writers, and a way, breaking away or dispensing with this straitjacket of modernism, right? However much we extend it or modify it, it's still, a term that we cannot escape. And they offer an opening to break away from that conceptual straitjacket, as I said before, and to see Joyce in a different way. And then, of course, we can add many other writers to the list. For example, Cabrera Infante in Tres Tigres invites comparison with Ulysses. However, the author slightly planted a reference to Joyce's book that steers comparison away from formalistic analysis and toward a more holistic conception of art and life. One of the characters in Tres Tristes Tigres refers to Bloomsday as the day Moll and Bloom, Moll y Bloom in the original, sitting in the pot, defecated the long stream of consciousness that would become a mojón, right, of literature. Cabrera's pun on mojón, Spanish for both milestone and solid thesis, reads like a cheeky remark that also acknowledges the centrality of Ulysses as a landmark, a mojón, of world literature, and its scatological or kinetic aspects, which many saw as a reflection of Joyce's Irish origin. At the same time, this reference also applies to Tres Tristes Tigres, a Cuban Ulysses where abstraction, linguistic or otherwise, is confronted by the embodied experience of nights of jazz, sultry dance, and drunken conversation in multiracial Havana before Fidel Castro's revolution. So the final thought, the wrap up here. Taking Joyce beyond the modernist canon, right? All these authors suggested minor understandings of his work that emphasize its local Irish dimension and its eccentricity within the Western literary tradition. Gustavo Sáenz, Obsesivos Días Circulares, another Joycean novel that engages fully with Ulysses, perhaps capture this idea that I'm trying to elaborate today with an episode, a rather comical episode. At different times in this novel, Obsesivos Días Circulares, the protagonist sniffs, he tries to read Ulysses, but he never finishes it, right? It's a challenge that he never, that has not a very successful ending. But he takes Ulysses with him everywhere he goes, right? And at different times in the novel, he sniffs his copy of Ulysses, takes a bath with it, ponders about its weight and dimensions, and notices how it warps in the humid beach weather of Acapulco, where it is carried away toward the shore by a family of crabs. Stripped off its modernist aura, the book becomes part of the Latin American literary landscape, a landscape that Joyce transforms as much as it transforms Joyce. And to understand this connection is to recover its double-edged condition as both a creative process and a critical framework that shows how modernist Joyce, Irish Joyce, and Hispanic Joyce are so similar, yet so different. Thank you.
Cada vida es muchos días, día tras día. Andamos por nosotros mismos, encontrándonos con ladrones, espectros, gigantes, ancianos, jóvenes, esposas, viudas, cuñados en el amor, pero siempre encontrándonos con nosotros mismos. El dramaturgo que escribió el folio de este mundo, y lo escribió con urgencia, hizo para nosotros primero la luz y el sol 2 días después. El Señor de las cosas, tal como son a quienes los católicos llaman Dio Boya, Dios verdugo, es indudablemente el todo en todos nosotros, mozo de cuadra y carnicero, y sería alcahuete y cornudo también, de no ser que en la economía del cielo, augurada por Hamlet, no hay más matrimonios. El hombre glorificado, ángel andrógino, es esposa de sí mismo. Every life is many days, day after day. We walk through ourselves, meeting robbers, ghosts, giants, old men, young men, wives, widows, brothers in love, but always meeting ourselves. The playwright who wrote the folio of this world and wrote it badly, he gave us lies first, and the sun 2 days later. The Lord of things as they are, whom the most Roman of Catholics call Dio Boya, hangman God, is doubtless all in all of us, Ostle and Batche, and will be bowed and cackled too, but that in the economy of heaven, foretold by Hamlet, there are no more marriages, glorified man, and androgynous angel, being a wife unto himself.